Good afternoon and welcome to the Michael Eure Show. Our very special guest today is Dr. Arwin D. Smallwood. And Dr. Smallwood is the professor and chair of the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University Department of History and Political Science and the Carter G. Woodson Distinguished Lecturer and I'll let him go into detail, Association for the Study of African American Life. So Dr. Smallwood, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'll try to make it as brief as I can, but I'm a native of Eastern North Carolina. I grew up in Bertie County in a little place called Indian Woods. So my family and I grew up here, and both sides of the family, mother and father, are from here, and all of my ancestors for hundreds of years. Attended Bertie High School, North Carolina Central for my undergraduate degree in political science, master's in history from North Carolina Central, and then my PhD from The Ohio State University.
Okay, well, so today our topic, and it's going to be a really deep topic, and for the audience, just let you know, if you have any questions, you need to put them in the chat, and we'll go back and get them towards the end of this presentation. If for some reason we go over a little bit, we will still answer your questions, and this is going to be a part 1 and a part 2 program. So I'm going to ask Sarah to just kind of move us over to the side, and we'll just start with our presentation.
Again, I want to thank you, Michael and Sarah, for advancing my slides for me, but for this invitation and opportunity to speak with your audience. And the title of the presentation is The Triracial Identity of Indians of North Carolina and Southeast Virginia. There's a historic relationship between the native peoples and even today the residents of Southeast Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. We'll touch on the Tuscarora Indians, the Meherrin Indians, and the Nottoway Indians. Both the Tuscarora and Meherrins are in North Carolina. The Nottoways are in Southeast Virginia. And then we'll touch on a few others in southeastern North Carolina near Hyde County, like the Bear River, Mattamuskeet, and Muchapungas, and we'll touch on those. So next slide, please. And I'm going to try to answer a few questions. Next slide, please. And so the question.
No, I was going to say, at this particular slide, you're getting ready to do it. I just wanted to know if you could pronounce these different groups, because I noticed a lot of them, there are places in North Carolina that are named after these particular tribes. So just go through the list, if you don't mind.
Sure. So here you have the Muchapungas. And again, the map shows the location of the Indians, and now I'll go through their, through the pronunciations. The Muchapungas, you have the Bear River Indians, you have the Mattamuskeet Indians, the Choanoke or Chowan Indians, the Yiapin, Hatteras, which are down in southeastern North Carolina coastal regions, the Core, the Roanoke Indians, which were on and along the Roanoke River, Moretuck Indians, also along the Roanoke River. Moretuck was also meant Roanoke. The Noose Indians, the Pamlico, the Poskeet, the Pasquotank, and then the Tuscaroras, Meherrin, and Nottoway. And as you see on the map, the Tuscaroras are split into what we call the upper Tuscaroras and the lower Tuscaroras. And they and the Meherrins and Nottoways, who are really of the same language group or families, like being French or German or English, they're of the same group, together created a pretty powerful confederation that stretched from southeast Virginia, kind of south of Petersburg, down into eastern North Carolina and down to the Cape Fear River. So the earlier Indians that I mentioned that were basically Algonquin Indians, which is another language group. And then the Tuscarora Indians, Meherrins, and Nottoways are Iroquois Indians. And then to the west of them, we'll have some Siouan tribes. But these are the tribes that, are concentrated in the eastern part of the state in southeast Virginia, and the places, the Indians that the English, when they settled or tried to settle North Carolina and then did settle Jamestown, the region that they're coming, that these are the Indians that they would have engaged and encountered during that time. Next slide, please. So the questions that I have here, I'm going to go back over them, but there are 5 basic questions I'm going to try to answer. And those questions are basically going to look at and try to help you better understand what happened with indigenous people prior to the arrival of Europeans, how Europeans impacted, white Europeans impacted indigenous people, and then how the introduction of Africans as slaves impacted indigenous people, and then how those peoples basically create a new culture. And we talk about triracial culture or triracial people. We're going to kind of talk about these different aspects of things and how things happen. Next slide, please. So the first question that I'm going to try to answer is, what have we overlooked about Black and indigenous peoples in America, particularly in North Carolina and Virginia, when studying the centuries before 1619? And the answer to that question is a great deal. Native people in North Carolina and Virginia before contact with Europeans, they did have a distinct culture, and I talked about the language groups. But once these peoples arrived, due to disease and warfare, many native peoples were reduced in number and in size, and oftentimes intermixed with runaway slaves and intermixed with white indentured servants, poor whites who were fleeing oppression from Virginia, and they created, new communities and new societies. This happened independently, but it also happened on plantations, and it even happened in the actual settlements themselves. And I'll touch on and talk a little bit about that as I go through the presentation. But you also have to go back to talk about the impact of Europeans. We all start our history in North Carolina with the English and even in Virginia, but really that history starts with the Spanish. And the Spanish will have a profound impact on the Chesapeake, on Virginia, on Eastern North Carolina, and Western North Carolina. And I'm going to touch on some of those today in this presentation. Next slide, please. So natives of Virginia and North Carolina at first contact. Next slide. So as I mentioned at the start, if you look at North Carolina, and this is a map of the eastern United States, pretty much native nations east of the Mississippi River, there were several major language groups in North America at the time of the arrival of European. Now, the language groups basically are just representing the fact that people spoke a language that was the same and they could communicate with one another. As I said before, it's like the French language or English or German or Russian. They're different language groups. Now, if you know anything about African nations or European history, you know that in world history, you could have many different Russians who speak different types of Russian of the Russian language of Russian, or many different types of English who speak different dialects or different types of English, right? So even today in America, we have a certain dialect that we speak. In England, it's different. And then if we look at Australia, which is another, English colony, their, dialect is a little different. So the language is basically the same and people can understand each other, but there are differences in dialect. So if you look at this map and you look at North Carolina, in North Carolina and Eastern North Carolina, you had Algonquin peoples who spoke the Algonquin language. But although they were different peoples and different nations of people, they spoke the same language and they could understand and communicate with one another. Then to the west of them were the Iroquois people. I mentioned the Tuscaroras, the Meherrins, and the Nottaways. They're highlighted in yellow, coming down from Petersburg and Richmond, Virginia, stretching throughout eastern North Carolina. And then in the western part of the state, in the mountains, you'll have the Cherokees, who also were Iroquoian and originally actually separated from what we call the Haudenosaunee people or the Iroquois people, and then settled in Tennessee and in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee. Next slide, please. Most of the native peoples who end up coming into North Carolina. So before we start talking about triracials or talking about native people and their impact or mixes with Africans, we have to talk about the societal structures. Even today, if you look in Southeast Virginia, Northeastern North Carolina, these Indian nations are named for the river systems that still exist and drain into the Albemarle Sound, beginning with the Nottoway River in Virginia, where the Nottoway Nation primarily settled, going down towards the Chowan. You have the Meherrin River, where the Meherrin nations settled as you come into North Carolina, and they converge into the Chowan. And then you have the Roanoke River. And then from the Roanoke, again, the Chewan come together into the Albemarle Sound. Native peoples used rivers to, of course, fish, to trade, to travel. And they settled on the banks of these rivers. They had gardens where they grew the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. But cultures, basically revolve around these various rivers. Next slide, please. And for the Iroquois people, that includes not just the river systems of Southeast Virginia and Northeastern North Carolina, but it also includes the river systems of Central Eastern North Carolina, the Tar River, the Neuse River. Next slide, please. And also the Cape Fear River. So Tuscaroras in particular are along the Cape Fear, they're along the Tar and the Neuse, but they are scattered throughout eastern North Carolina, pretty much from Raleigh and Durham to the coast, and even the Greensboro region, Guilford County, you'll see Tuscaroras being hunting and traveling throughout that region as well. Next slide, please. And I put this slide in just to talk about the Southeastern Indians, because there's great interaction between between the Tuscaroras, who are considered Northeastern Indians, Northeastern Woodland Indians, and the Southeastern Woodland Indians. And that pretty much is the divide of this river system, the PD River system. Those Indians south of the PD River tend to be what we would consider Southeastern Indians, the Catawba Indians, the Yamasee Indians, the PD, and a number of other smaller tribes. But that's kind of the dividing point between the North Carolina Indians, or the Northeastern Indians, and the Southeastern Indians, who tended to be Siouan Indians in South Carolina and in the Piedmont of South Carolina and North Carolina. Next slide, please. So when we start talking about the triracials and we start talking about these native groups, it's important for us to, again, understand the geography of North Carolina and Virginia and its neighbor, South Carolina, understand the native nations and where they were situated, and understand that just like today, the state of North Carolina has a relationship with Virginia, it has a relationship with South Carolina, the United States has a relationship with Canada, and it has a relationship with Mexico. Native nations had relationships. They had trading partnerships. They had military alliances with one another to protect each other. So again, when we look at Southeast Virginia, and although the people of Southeast Virginia, there's a mix of Iroquois and Algonquin peoples, again, these peoples did interact with one another, and they did maintain alliances with one another, and they maintained communication with one another as it pertains to the introduction of Europeans into their regions, as well as the introduction of Africans later. So we have to understand that there was a thriving culture of native peoples that existed prior to the arrival of Europeans. And then when the Europeans arrived, they will have a tremendous impact on those cultures and really turning many societies upside down. Next slide, please. So the reason I focus on Tuscaroras, Meherrins, and Nottaways when we start talking about, nations that are, are triracial nations, I'm going to give you a couple examples why, but that is one of the most influential nations of Indians that are in North Carolina during this particular time period. And the Nottaways, the Tuscaroras, and the Meherrins are Iroquois, as I said before, and they are, connected by blood to what we call the Iroquois Confederacy. Collectively, they are called the Haudenosaunee people, and they maintain their connections with those people throughout before the arrival of Europeans and even after the arrival of Europeans. In fact, many Tuscaroras after the Tuscarora War will leave North Carolina and relocate in New York State and Pennsylvania, and they will officially be recognized by the British government as the sixth nation of the Iroquois Confederacy, which was the most powerful Indian confederation in the history of North America. These routes show the migration pattern that as one people, they migrated out of the Mississippi River Valley, out of the great city of Cahokia, ancient city of Cahokia, move east, separate into what becomes known as the Six Nations or Five Nations, the Mohawks, the Oneidas, Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, and then in North Carolina, three nations the Tuscaroras, the Nottaways, and the Meherrins. And then again, there are nations to the south of them that I mentioned before, the Cherokee, who actually were Haudenosaunee originally, but separated and moved into Tennessee. But then down in the southeast, their neighbors, the Creeks, the Catawbas, the Yamasees, the Santee, and then to the west towards Tennessee and Mississippi, you have the Chickasaws and the Choctaws. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to read all of these, but this is a detailed listing of all of the Native Americans that were in the coastal plains of North Carolina at the time of first contact between the English or Europeans, Spanish, the English, and other Europeans. These are all of the nations of Indians that would have been in contact, would have been in place during that first contact. Now, I've gone over several of them already, so if you're looking at the slide presentation, you see that we've talked about the Moratucks and the Roanoks and the Chowanoks or Chowan. So we've talked about most of these Indians, but I'm just restating them here so that people have a very clear understanding of the many different nations of Indians that existed in eastern North Carolina and in some cases Southeast Virginia during the time of first contact. Next slide, please. And that's just a continuation of all of the different Indian groups that would be found in the Piedmont of North Carolina. So you have the Tidewater regions of North Carolina, which is pretty much from the mouths of the rivers, the Roanoke, the Tar, the Neuse, the Cape Fear, and the Chowan rivers eastward. Those are Tidewater Indians. And then from the mouth of those rivers up to around Raleigh, just west of Rocky Mount would be considered the coastal plains. And then you had your coastal plains Indians, which we just looked at that slide. Then we have the Piedmont Indians. So from Raleigh westward into the Piedmont before you get to the mountains, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, the Charlotte area, but the Piedmont, these are the nations of Indians that you would find there in that area. The Occaneechees, the Saponis, in the Halawa, the Tutelos, but again, a number of different Indians that would be found in the Piedmont regions of North Carolina and also Virginia and South Carolina. And then in the mountains of North Carolina, of course, again, there are the Cherokees. The Cherokees really were in the valley in Tennessee, what is the Tennessee Valley, really Cherokees mostly in Tennessee, between the Tennessee River, what was called at one time the Cherokee River, which stretches from the western part of Tennessee to the east. So that's kind of the breakdown of Native peoples and Native cultures in North Carolina. And that's really kind of our starting point as we begin to talk about, well, when and why and how do these intermixes occur between Native Americans, Africans, and Europeans. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to try to very briefly talk about the impact of the Spanish. Next slide. If we were to look at North America, and I just tried to briefly explain that there's a distinction between the Northeast and the Southeastern Indians, and that divide is the Cape Fear River. The Indians north of the Cape Fear River, including the Tuscaroras and the Indians of Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, were considered Northeastern Indians. And the Indians south of the Cape Fear, the Catawba, the Santee, the Yamasees, are considered to be Southeastern Indians. So if we were to look at a map of North America and specifically the American South at the start, at first contact in 1492, we have a makeup that's something like this because the Tuscaroras are one of the largest and most powerful groups of Indians, and they kind of dominate trade and relationships in North Carolina between the Indians of North Carolina and their neighbors in Virginia. Next slide, please.
I'm going to interrupt. Just
yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about the Tuscarora I? That's one. And the second one about the settlements on former Indian capitals of what are cities now. And then I know you got to go through a lot, and we're almost we're at the halfway point, and I know we got a long way to go, but I just wanted to ask those questions really quick. Go ahead.
Okay. So the question that Michael is asking, Mr. Eure is asking, amongst the Tuscarora people, because they intermix with Europeans early, and they're one of the groups that claims responsibility for the destruction and absorption of the lost colony. Many members of the Tuscarora Nation were born with blue eyes, green eyes, gray eyes, and sometimes with auburn hair. If you've ever seen people with kind of reddish hair, it's like a reddish auburn hair. But this eye became known amongst the Six Nations and among other Indian nations as the Tuscarora eye because it was so prevalent amongst the Tuscarora. Remembering most native people had black hair and they had brown eyes, right? And so the Tuscaroras distinguished themselves amongst their neighbors who are Algonquins or other Iroquois Indians and even the Siouan Indians because there were so many of their members that had these characteristics. And no matter where they migrated to, whether it was New York State, Canada, Louisiana, no matter where they migrated, even scattered throughout parts of eastern North Carolina, they still carried those characteristics with them. And you'll see those who end up intermarrying more heavily with African Americans. You'll see dark-skinned African Americans with blue eye, piercing blue eyes. You see them of all different shades of color in terms of skin color, but the eyes, are pretty consistent amongst the Tuscarora themselves, as well as the whites and the Africans that they were found to have intermarried with. And then the other question that Michael is asking is a result of the Tuscarora War, which which is much later than this period. We're in the colonial period now, the early colonial period during first contact with the Spanish and English. But the Tuscarora War occurs in 1711, from 1711 to 1713. And after the Tuscarora War and the defeat of the Tuscarora, about a third of the Tuscarora were killed, another third were enslaved. The others became refugees and fled North Carolina and were scattered from Virginia through Pennsylvania into New York State and even over into Canada. And you still see the remnants of that migration. If you go throughout the western part of Maryland, you'll find counties named Tuscarora, high schools named Tuscarora. You get into Pennsylvania, you'll have the Tuscarora Mountains in Pennsylvania. In New York State, you'll have Tuscarora Mountain and Slide Mountain. So this forced migration out of North Carolina and back to the lands of their ancestors in New York State and Pennsylvania will leave in marks all along the landscape from North Carolina to Pennsylvania and to New York, as well as Canada. Even the Tuscarora Trail, which goes up through the mountains, through West Virginia, Maryland, and through Pennsylvania, still bears the name of the Tuscaroras who left North Carolina after the defeat in that war. In fact, the Tuscarora Trail is called the Death Trail because so many Tuscaroras died in that forced migration out of North Carolina at the close of the Tuscarora War between 1713 and 1715. This image represents, and I know we're going to wind down in a moment, represents the Spanish and their conquests of the Americas and the conquistadors, their explorations of the Americas. Next slide, please. And it's important for people to understand that the Spanish were in North America first, that the Spanish, did detailed maps of the southeastern part of the United States, Florida, Texas, Louisiana, South Carolina. They mapped Indian nations and Indian villages. So the Spanish had a great knowledge of the native peoples of North America. Next slide, please. But very few people, I think, understand that the Spanish also had incursions into North Carolina. That the Spanish raided the coast of North Carolina for slaves. There was a very brisk Native American slave trade that was conducted by the Spanish, in which they enslaved native women and children, particularly women. They shipped them back to Europe to serve as concubines and sex slaves for the Europeans. So there was a very brisk slave trade in the Caribbean that the Spanish controlled before the British arrived, in Mexico and in Central America, as well as in North America. And so as this map illustrates, the Spanish were all along the coast of North Carolina. They raided villages along the coast in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. They attempted to plant settlements, and it did establish colonies in Florida and in Florida, South Carolina, and also Virginia. I think very few people realize, along with DeSoto and Pardo's expeditions into the western part of North Carolina, where they spread disease and attacked Indians, very few people realize that in 1570, the Spanish established a mission, a Catholic church in what is now Jamestown, Virginia, and attempted to convert the Indians of Virginia to Catholicism. And so they had a tremendous impact on the native peoples of North Carolina and Virginia and South Carolina, but throughout the Southeast, that will lead to mixing between Indians, Africans, and Europeans. Next slide, please. These are just examples of the expeditions in the western part of North Carolina and the forts that were set up in South Carolina and North Carolina. Next slide, please. And then the campaigns through that region. I mean, if you look at these drawings were done by Bartholomew, who accompanied the Spanish conquistadors in their campaigns in North Carolina and throughout the Americas. Different native villages look different. The way they built their houses were different. Very clear from this illustration that these are longhouses. The Iroquois built longhouses. And so you can tell Tuscarora, Meherrin, Nottoway houses, as well as the rest of the Six Nations from other Indian nations, because they had a distinct look. Next slide, please. But the Spanish attacked these houses and attacked these people, seizing their food supplies, burning and destroying their communities, taking their women and children. Next slide, please. And generally intimidating the people, using war dogs to hunt people down, rip them to pieces. I apologize again for some of these slides, they're graphic, but these are the things that happened to Native people by the Spanish in the Southeast, but also in North Carolina. Next slide, please. They murdered chiefs, like I said, they raided their villages, they burned houses, took belongings. Next slide, please. And again, to intimidate and instill fear in Native communities throughout the Southeast, but particularly in North Carolina and Virginia. Next slide, please. So you see the graphic nature of this, the burning alive of Native people, the hanging of chiefs and clan mothers, the taking of their children and women. Again, it's a very violent campaign. Next slide, please. This is an image of a Native people's hands and feet being chopped off, by the Spanish. Now, before I found these images, there was at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, they have, oral recorded, audio recorded and transcribed histories by Tuscaroras that were told, to observers. And one of those histories, one of those stories is about the handless maiden, about the fact that there was this young girl, beautiful young girl, whose hands had been chopped off. Now, I thought that was just some type of metaphor. I thought that was a story that was just told to young kids to kind of, keep them on the right path. But when I found these drawings by Bartholomew, I understood that this was actually a true event. It's something that actually had happened, and it had stayed with the Tuscarora people for generations, and it was recorded in their stories that were passed down from generation to generation. Next slide, please. And so most of this is happening in the western part of North Carolina, coming up through South Carolina. So this is the Spanish region that, is affected by these campaigns by the Spanish. And it's important to understand that one of the results of this is alliances, right? Traditionally, the Catawba Indians and the Siouan Indians were enemies of the, Iroquois Indians, the Tuscaroras, Meherrins, and Nottoways. But because of this campaign by the Spanish, we're going to see shifting alliances in the West. And so the Tutelos and the Saponis, they will end up falling into alliance with the Tuscaroras. And we'll see that they are pretty much in alliance with the Iroquois right on down through the 1700s. And if you go to Grand River Six Nation reserves today in Canada, you'll still find Tutelos and Saponis living amongst the Six Nations as allies and as friends. And whereas with the Catawba remain at odds with the Tuscaroras and they remain enemies. But this region here, what we're talking about between that separates the lands of the Tuscaroras or the Iroquois people from the Siouan people, these campaigns lead to some major political, realignments, not to mention the changes in the populations due to the impact of disease as well as warfare during this time period. Next slide, please. So the mixing of people, and I know I'm out of time. I'm probably already out of time, so I'm running low on time. So I'm going to just now throw in and help you understand that this mixing begins as early as 1492 and between 1492 and 1584, and it only increases after the English come to North Carolina, explore, and create the Roanoke settlement on Roanoke Island. Next slide, please. So it's important to understand that the Spanish for almost 100 years have been in the Americas, exploiting the Caribbean, exploiting Central America, Mexico, the southeastern United States, the coast of North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, and Florida. And they are taking Native people, particularly Native women, out, and they're taking them back to Europe, and they're selling them in Europe as slaves. And they are beginning to import Africans into the Caribbean and even into Florida. One of the other things I think it's important to note here is that many of the Africans who came originally with the Spanish and end up in Florida and parts of the Americas actually are coming as conquistadors, as soldiers. And if you look at Fort St. Augustine's, where Jacksonville, Florida is established today, Fort St. Augustine's was a fort that was garrisoned by all African soldiers under the Spanish flag. And it was their job to basically pacify the Indians in the southeast and protect the road to Zacatecas. So it's important to understand that there was a lot of Africans have been brought even as far north as what is now Parris Island. I think it's called Fort Juan, what is now Parris Island in South Carolina. Large numbers of Africans were brought to that location and were there. So there were Africans introduced all throughout Florida, South Carolina, parts of Georgia, even as far north as Virginia and North Carolina. But Africans have been introduced into the hemisphere, clearly in the Caribbean, in South America, Central America, in Mexico. And these Africans, as slaves on plantations, intermixed with Indians who had been enslaved, but they also intermixed in the frontier as they ran away from plantations, and even as soldiers that settled in the Americas. A very complex, stratified society in Spanish America when we talk about race mixing, and some of that finds its way into North America and into Eastern North Carolina. Next slide, please. So again, Indians, Africans, and whites, poor whites who were indentured servants, which are basically white slaves, brought to the Americas, also to Virginia, basically want a better life, and they want freedom too, so they run away. And these three groups on the plantations as slaves, in runaway communities, what we call maroon communities, and also in Indian villages, because Indians took in runaway Africans and took in runaway white indentured servants who did not want to live as people of in servitude to white elites. And all these people intermarried in these isolated maroon communities or runaway slave communities in these Indian villages, and then through force on plantations where they were all being forced to work together as slaves on plantation. So there was mixing occurring all throughout the Americas, all throughout Virginia and North Carolina as a result of these practices. Next slide, please. So we will see that overlapping of culture, the creolization of North Carolina culture between Native Americans and Africans. And this is where we get our triracial isolates. We know about mulattoes, people, and mulattoes originally were a mix of Indian and white, but we understand it as a mix of white and black. But mulatto could be a mix of Indian and white, Indian and black, or Indian and white. So it was just, we have all these overlaps. You have whites and Indians that are mixed. You have blacks and whites that are mixed. You have blacks and Indians that are mixed, black Indians, and then you have your triracial isolates who are of the bloodline of all three. Next slide, please. So this just illustrates, the migration, and we're going to move quickly through these slides. This is the Middle Passage. Africans, as the African slave trade accelerates, we have more and more Africans being brought into the Americas, and they find their way into North Carolina. Next slide, please. And again, this is from the raiding of African villages in Africa for slaves. Next slide. Their ordeal was not unlike the ordeal of Native people in terms of the slave trade. Next slide, please. And so it's important to understand that during the slave trade, after the slave trade, and after Africans are brought to the Americas, next slide, that there is going to be a mutual understanding of the cruelties that Europeans have perpetrated against these people. Next slide, please. So the Africans who are forcibly brought from Africa and forced to work on plantations in the Americas, And the native people who have been exploited and intimidated and enslaved and shipped the opposite way back to Europe, these people actually forge alliances and friendships. They are both being exploited and they both understand it, and they've both been brutalized. And so they actually forge alliances. So it's these, and so it's important to understand in the first 100 years, 200 years of colonization and the development of Americas, the relationship between Indians and Africans was a much closer relationship than I think many people realize. Next slide, please. They are suffering the same, oppression. They're suffering the same exploitation. And so for Africans and Indians who are enslaved on plantations together, it was a natural understanding that they forged friendships and alliances. And when Africans were able to escape and Indian slaves were able to escape, again, they all could tell the same stories about how they were, how they were abused under the institution of slavery. Next slide, please. So the English, Michael, you have to tell me. I'm thinking we're out of time now. We're way over time, so you have to stop me because we can keep going with this. But
well, we're out of special time, but we're going to go. This is very important, and I think we're going to try to get up to the Tuscarora War. But if we don't, this is a good place that I think we definitely need to talk about. Go ahead.
Much of what I've just talked about is really the early intermixing between Africans and Native Americans and Europeans, which create triracial peoples on plantations, in independent societies or maroon societies that are free of slavery, and also in the communities, the established white settlements, right? So this is happening, like I said, from 1492 until the 1580s when the English attempt to establish their colonies. So for 100 years, we have a lot of racial mixing taking place, right? And it's not just in Central America, South America, Mexico. Is happening even in Florida and even as far north as southeastern North Carolina and South Carolina. Next slide, please. But then we have the coming of the English, right? The English are coming to Roanoke Island and they are exploring the river systems of northeastern North Carolina and of eastern North Carolina, and they're making contact with the native peoples that are in that region. Next slide. So we know from John White's drawings that, and from the writings about early exploration of eastern North Carolina, well documented, the coastal areas. This is a map of eastern North Carolina. It shows clearly the Outer Banks. It shows Roanoke Island. It shows the Albemarle Sound. It shows the Roanoke River and the Chelan River. You have to turn it sideways. If you turn this map sideways, then it looks just like eastern North Carolina, right? And if you look at the map closely, you'll see that eastern North Carolina is called Virginia. I can't, show you here, but if you read across the top of the illustration, you'll see a large V. You'll see an I that's in the forest there. You'll see the R on the north side of the Roanoke. You see the G, right there, by the Meherrin River. And then you'll see I, and then beneath it again, N-I-A, Virginia. And so that's when I start talking about Virginia and North Carolina, and I say they're kind of interchangeable in the relationship between Indian peoples, the Algonquins and the Iroquois, because the English saw the whole region as Virginia. And when they moved to Jamestown, they called Virginia now what we know of as Virginia proper, Virginia, but they call, North Carolina Old Virginia, because that's the way they saw it. So there was a great understanding of this region and of the nations of Indians that are in this region. And the Indians knew the Europeans, particularly the English, not to mention the Spanish, because they'd had interactions with the Spanish before, and now they were having these interactions with the English, and they were not very positive. Next slide, please. You see the villages. These are mapped from John White as well. Look the same as the villages that the Spanish had, right? So you see the Iroquois villages, you see the longhouses, same palisades. Next slide, please. They are well-developed society, laid out villages and communities. This illustrates, tobacco in the center top part of this image is a little field of tobacco. But then you go over, you see corn to the right on the right corner. You see fields of corn. And then down from that, you see a garden with the three sisters. You see squash. You see beans, with the three sisters are corn, beans, and squash. and you see it growing in the garden, and you see the native communities there. So I always point to this illustration because people say, well, where Native Americans weren't very civilized or they didn't have any, real culture. No, they were very cultured, and they had a great civilization. They had religion. They took care of their children and their families. They loved their families and had extended families. And in these long houses, their extended families lived. You would have generations living in the same house, the children, the parents, the grandparents, and if they were still alive, the great grandparents all lived in the same house and in community clusters. Everyone within the village is related by blood. They're all cousins. And we still see remnants of that in communities throughout Eastern North Carolina today. And we also still see, if you grew up in Eastern North Carolina like I did, the family still grow the three sisters. They still grow corn, beans, squash. They grow white potatoes, all of these crops, tobacco, which made North Carolina great. But these things did not exist in Europe before they arrived in North America and made contact with the native people. These are crops that are native to North America. And now we eat them with, and you go to most restaurants down east, the seafood, oysters, shrimp, the various herring was, the herring, basically spawn up the Roanoke, the Tar, the Neuse rivers by the millions, the Chowan rivers by the millions. So all of these things, the native people were taking advantage of. So I have to take a moment to say this because even African Americans today and whites who live in the region today, we, take these things in stride and assume that we've always done these things. But all these things were taught to us by, in some cases, our native ancestors, who were either forced into slavery and intermarried or just freely intermarried. And so today we've forgotten about that native ancestry, but all these things were introduced to us by then. Next slide, please. And you just see the abundance of the landscape. You see fish. These are the images of natives fishing in the Albemarle Sound. So all kinds of fish, and they're catching all kinds of fish in the Sound. And so they had a very fertile landscape, and they had a very abundant life, which is taught to, the Africans and to the Europeans when Europeans move into the region. Next slide, please. So the spreading of disease. Next slide. It's important to understand when we say, well, how do we get this mixing? If you read the records, the colonial records of North Carolina, we know that when the English arrived, yes, the Indians did greet them friendly, and they did try to negotiate with them and trade with them. But one of the things that happened is everywhere the English went, they spread disease. Every village that they touched, people died by the hundreds. They wiped out whole villages of people, old men, women, and children, from these diseases. We see the pandemic today and the impact that it's having today, but we can do this presentation virtually and we can avoid contact with each other and not have the type of deaths that they had. But at that time, again, with the spreading of the diseases that the early explorers, English explorers, they pretty much decimated most of the native communities of the Outer Banks of North Carolina and into the interior of the coastal regions of North Carolina, the Tidewater regions of North Carolina. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this impacts not just northeastern North Carolina, the Chowan, Roanoke, Meherrin, Nottoway rivers, but it also impacts, central coastal plains, the Tar, the Neuse rivers as well, because they are exploring and mapping that whole area, the Albemarle Sound, the Pamlico Sound, the mouths of these rivers, and everywhere they go to, interact with native people, they are spreading disease, and that disease is ravaging that area. In these early times, you got to have a cohesive village, a cohesive family to survive. And as these men and these people are impacted by these diseases, as old men and women are, decimated, young children die, when Africans are introduced and the Europeans are introduced at Roanoke, it actually, most native communities will adopt people. They will bring people in and they will adopt them into their communities. And through those adoptions, they make them family and they intermarry with them. And through that intermarriage, we see that because they have to replace the people that have been lost to disease and or to warfare. But in this case, just the disease alone has a tremendous impact. Now, we already talked about the Spanish. in the Chesapeake, right? Enslaving, we saw the type of impact they had, right? Not just in the western part of North Carolina, but along the coast of North Carolina as well. And now the English have come back and they're having a similar impact. Although they're not attacking villages in that way, the disease that they are spreading is having the same type of a impact on these native communities. Next slide, please. Again, this is just showing again as far south as the Cape Fear region, you know, that these impacts are happening. Next slide. And so, and I'm going to pause, I'm going to stop us here, Eure, for a few questions, because I won't make it to the Tuscarora War because I don't want to spend all of the time talking. I do want to, you know, answer any questions that might come up. But this map I come back to, we started with it, now we're back at this map, right? If you look at the early English map of Eastern North Carolina, some of these Indians that will end up being there in the time of the Tuscarora War between around 1711 to 1713 did not exist prior to that period, but prior to the 1600s and 1700s. The Machapungas, for example, and remnants of them still live in Hyde County, which is south of the Albemarle Sound in eastern North Carolina. These are Black Indians. The Machapunga Indians are Black Indians, and they did not exist prior to the arrival of Europeans and the release on Roanoke Island of over 300 African, you know, maroons that the English had picked up in the Spanish Caribbean, armed and brought to North Carolina and released as a reward for their service to the English in raiding and destroying Spanish settlements and Spanish ships to seize gold and silver. The Bear River Indians, they did not exist, Black Indians. So you had Indians, but these Indians, you know, looked different. The Mattamuskeet Indians, they looked different. They were clearly mixed with African, and they're scattered all throughout the Alligator Swamp area, but the areas of southeastern North Carolina and northeastern North Carolina, and they didn't exist prior to the arrival of the Europeans and the introduction of these African maroons and the lost colony, the white colonists that were, you know, basically left on Roanoke Island in this area. If we go down, remnants of the Hatteras Indians, we also see the Choanoke Indians, because there are Choanoke Indians still in northeastern North Carolina. There are still Meherrins and Nottaways. If we talk about the Nottaways of Virginia, and this, some of this mixing is not from this early period, it just continues throughout the 1600s and 1700s. When I talk about the Nottaway Indians, a person that everybody will know, the name they'll know, is Nat Turner. Everyone's heard of Nat Turner, and everybody knows about Nat Turner's revolt in southeastern Virginia. But how many people know that Nat Turner's great-great-granddaughter is chief of the Nottaway Nation of Indians of Virginia today, and that they see him as an Indian? He was a Black Indian. He was a Nottaway Indian. And so it's important to understand that these Indians and Blacks are thoroughly intermixed and intertwined in the 16 and 1700s, and even today into the 1800s when we start talking about Gabriel Prosser's revolt, Nat Turner's revolt. I mean, a lot of these insurrections in Bertie County, North Carolina, in Indian Woods, which was a Tuscarora reservation, there was what was called, you know, the Great Slave Conspiracy, which occurred in Easter in 1802 or 1801. And it was the worst planned slave insurrection in the history of the state of North Carolina. And it was a insurrection orchestrated by Tuscarora Indians and Blacks. And many of the Tuscaroras were mixed with Black. In fact, some of the Tuscaroras who left to relocate to New York and Canada was so dark they looked African. So it's important to understand that, you know, all throughout this region from southeast Virginia down into eastern North Carolina, Bertie County, and even further south, the relationship between the Indians who escaped enslavement and lived in the swamps in the Alligator or Great Dismal and in various swampy areas throughout southeastern North Carolina, that there was a long historic relationship between these communities, either on the plantations as Indian peoples and independent Indian communities, or as maroon communities, where these were places where slaves ran away to not be captured, and they found other Indians living there who had been driven out of their lands, out of their ancestral homes, and also poor whites who were white indentured servants who were fleeing, persecution and basically indentured servant is slavery, freeing slavery themselves, and basically mixing with these Africans and Indians in these areas in which they could not be tracked by dogs, particularly in the swamps, because the dogs were of no use to them in the swamp. They couldn't track these runaways in the swamp. So I'm going to stop there. We didn't get to the Tuscarora War, but what I'm saying is there's so much to discuss and talk about before we even get to the Tuscarora War to kind of help understand what the Tuscarora War was about, because it was about slavery. It was about the Tuscaroras, their women and children being kidnapped and sold into slavery, and about them harboring runaway slaves. They would harbor blacks who ran away in their settlements. And that led to that great conflict, that bloody war. And that also was the most destructive war in colonial North Carolina history, and nearly ended the North Carolina colony. It was such a destructive war. So I'll stop there and entertain any questions that anyone may have.
This is from Allison Lully from North Carolina History. This might be part one. I would certainly tune in for part two. Great informative talk. And I can answer that part two is going to be on January the 14th. And it'll be our celebration of Martin Luther King Day, because his actual birthday was March the 15th. So thank you, Allison. And Dr. Smallwood, and some people will be getting this via podcast, and they won't be able to see the slides, but I think you did a good job of describing them. But could you give people your contact information? Because we talked today. Today was like a class, college students. So I hope you got a lot out of it. Can you just give us your contact information, Dr. Smallwood?
I will. I'll type it in. Type it in now.
For the audience, it's on the screen.
Oh, it's already there. Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you. Okay.
Go ahead. If you could just say the number 336.
Okay, yeah. My direct number here at A&T is 336-285-2048. Again, 336-285-2048. And then my email address is asmallwo at ncat.edu.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Again, from Christy Shields. She is the Director of Student Activities at Wake Tech. I agree with Allison. I would love to hear more. So we're going to have you back. Maybe when the pandemic is over, we can have you come on the campus and do a presentation for our students. But with Christy and Dr. Malone, maybe we can get together and have you do a virtual well, you can certainly do the MLK, but we'd like to expose our students to people like you and places they might want to go to, like North Carolina A&T, major in engineering and political science.
Well, certainly, we would certainly love to have you. And so I do want to say that as well. We would enjoy having your students here in our department and at the university in general. So we certainly love it.
And to this audience, because we went over a lot, but it was very much worth it, I want to say we look forward to seeing you in 2021 on January the 14th at 12 o'clock. I'm on the wrong time. On 12 o'clock, and it will possibly be longer. And for all of you who have people that want to look at this, it's going to be on YouTube, and they can get it, certainly by 6 o'clock this evening. All they got to do is put in the Michael Eure Show, look for this particular one. And again, thank you, Dr. Smallwood. Do you have any closing statements?
No, just that, again, I encourage everyone to learn as much as you can about your own past, your own history, but certainly about the history of North Carolina. I think we have a very unique history, and I love sharing it with people. So do explore and learn more about North Carolina history and visit these places.